paranormal believers of Reddit, what made you believe? Serious. When I was younger, my mom used to invite random neighborhood children over for dinner and parties so they could eat. At my sister's birthday party, everyone was outside getting ready to hit the piñata. My father noticed a girl sitting inside staring out the window at us. We have a large window beside front door. He told me to go inside and ask her to come out and join the party. I ran up the walkway, looking at her through the window as I went towards the door, and then as soon as I passed through the doorway, losing sight of her for a few seconds, she was gone. My dad thought she had fallen. There's a couch in front of the window, so he thought she fell on the couch. I looked around for her but couldn't find her, so I told my dad. He helped me look for her, but still nothing. No one else saw her except me and my dad. My mom said she didn't recall inviting any girls with our description of her. We forgot about it until some years later, though I don't really know exactly how many. My dad and I were sitting in the living room watching TV. From my dad's armchair you can see into the kitchen a little bit. Me and my dad were talking about the show we were watching when he suddenly got quiet. He said my name and motioned for me to come over to him. He told me to look at the microwave. I saw the girl's reflection in the microwave, exactly the same as before. I ran into the kitchen and my dad followed, but again no one was there. We were both pretty spooked, so we went out for ice cream until my mom came home. I thought it was a neighborhood kid playing a prank on us the first time. But seeing her the second time unchanged in our kitchen many years later made me start believing in ghosts. Shortly after my mother died, I heard her call my name and I turned around and she was standing before me, smiling. Then she simply vanished. I've never hallucinated before or since. I have no mental problems, etc., so I feel like I have to at least entertain the possibility it was for real. When I moved in with my boyfriend, he told me there was a ghost man that had always followed him wherever he lived. I am a firm believer in the paranormal anyway, but it really didn't bother me after some reassurances that he was benevolent. Not long after moving in, our roommate's girlfriend started staying over more often, and this ghost hated her. If she'd use our bathroom, the faucets would both turn on full blast. This would always cause her to run out of the bathroom with her pants around her ankles. The ceiling fans would turn on by themselves. The TV would increase volume on its own. You had to unplug it to get it to stop. We replaced the TV. That one did the same thing. After a few months of weird SHD happening, I awoke to the feeling of someone sitting at the foot of the bed. I felt the bed compress as though a real person had sat down. I jerked up and looked around and saw nothing, but there was an imprint in our comforter where someone had sat. Several more weeks go by and finally the same thing happened again. Only this time there was a man there. Big hat, trench coat, looked like he was straight out of a western. After a few seconds he disappeared. I told my boyfriend about him and his response was, "Oh good, he finally let you see him." After that it just became normal. He sat at the end of the bed most nights while I was pregnant, and then after the baby was born he must have went in and sat with her. We would still catch glimpses of him here or there, and you'd hear footsteps when home alone. We eventually broke up, and I gotta say I miss the ghost way more than the boyfriend. Personally never experienced anything, but I've heard some pretty strange stories that really can't be explained any other way. For instance, my dad's aunt is the crazy one because she has psychic abilities, for lack of a better word. My dad took my mom to meet her, and she asked my mom, "Who's that standing behind you?" And of course my mom thought it was my dad just sorta messing around, but she went on to say, "No, it's a woman in a tracksuit." And my mom flipped. When she was a kid, she had a super strong relationship with her grandmother who died of a heart attack, and my mom always talked about her visiting her in her dreams. But when they buried my mom's grandmother, they buried her in a tracksuit, and my mom swears that she's never told anyone else what they buried her in, so there'd be no way for my dad's aunt to know. It's just things like that can't really be explained, and other weird things that happen. A few years ago my great-grandmother was in her last few days. My family lives a couple of hours away and I wasn't really able to get there. I had just seen her a couple of weeks before that and had personally made peace with the inevitable. One night I had a dream where my great-grandmother and I had a nice, long conversation in the house that she had lived in when I was a young kid. We talked about her life and experiences, my life, and my future. It was the most vivid and lucid dream I've ever had. The next morning, my mother called with the bad news that my great-grandmother had passed during the night, probably about 11 p.m. I don't know at what time I had that dream, but I definitely didn't go to bed before 11. I have two spooky incidents that happened after my dad died. First time is that my dad passed away while we were out of the country. It was very unexpected. A couple days before he passed, he had issues sending and receiving texts/calls. His phone was always on for business calls/emergencies when we were on vacation/traveling. Several days after we get back home and are planning his funeral with my family, I'm confessing to them that he embarrassed me at dinner, and my last conversation with him was us arguing before he passed and felt horribly guilty. Just as I explain that, I hear my phone go off and see a text from my dad. We had his phone charging in the kitchen, so it was already creeping us out that none of us had touched it for the past few days. I opened the text and it said, "I love you, love Dad." I obviously lost it, and so did my family. My logical mind says that it's just a text he sent while I was testing his phone the week prior that finally went through, but his phone was on and connected for at least 3 days back home, and the text came at that exact moment. A month or so after my dad passed, I was driving to the first family get-together since the funeral, and I was sort of in a funk that this is the first family outing without my dad. As I'm driving through a rural area, I hear my dad's voice yell at me to stop. He taught me to drive, and I was very familiar with his panic yells. I slam on my brakes at an intersection with a green light for me, and an 18-wheeler comes barreling through the intersection. If I didn't stop, I would have definitely been hit. Once again, could be grief and thinking about the times my dad taught me how to drive, but still weirds me out to this day. Haven't had any other weird instances since these, and it's been almost 8 years now. Experiences. My own and other people's. There are things nobody understands that happen. This is one of many stories. My grandma plus uncles bought a house together in 2008 because it was unbelievably cheap. Every man who was married or in a relationship who slept in a particular room in the house would wake up from the same nightmare. We later found out a woman who had been raped by her husband's married friends had hung herself there 30 years prior, and the house had been going from owner to owner ever since. They, my family, did a bunch of purification rituals and finally ended up locking that room up for good. And that kept it okay for a while, but 3 years later, my grandma also passed in the same house, so nobody wanted to stay there anymore and they sold it again. For the same unbelievably low price they got it in the first place. I have many other stories that are just inexplicable if not for something supernatural or other dimensional. I don't know how much I believe in most paranormal things, but when I think about the topic, I can't help but think of the mantis shrimp can see. The human eye can sense red, green, and blue, and with varying combinations of those 3 colors, we get to enjoy millions of colors. The mantis shrimp has 16 different receptors, meaning the mantis shrimp can see in potentially trillions of colors we are physically incapable of even imagining. I believe that it's not just possible, but almost guaranteed, that there's a huge portion of knowledge we're locked out of because we, as a species, simply are lacking whatever specialized organs that would allow us to study and explain. Problem is, try imagining a brand new sense. How do you explain it to others that have never felt it? If you can't feel it, how do you build a machine that translates it into senses you can experience? There's just so much we don't know that we don't know. Current scientific evidence suggests the paranormal doesn't exist, but I'm willing to say there's every chance that we don't know how to interact with that part of the universe yet, and that one day the supernatural skeptics, myself included, may be completely proven wrong. My husband and I live in a 100-year-old house. It's always been a little creepy, like hearing people talking in another room and going in and there's no one there. But, a couple of years ago we had 2 really good hauntings that totally convinced me the paranormal is real. The first thing that happened was when I was sleeping on the living room floor in front of the TV because I hurt my back and was trying to get it to unkink. I woke up at 4 a.m. and I heard the mantel clock chime 4. I'm sure I was awake because I watched TV for a few minutes. I heard my husband walk into the room behind me, pick up the comforter and spoon behind me with his arm thrown over my waist. After a couple of minutes it was like his arm weighed a ton. And he was throwing a lot of heat. Just about then I heard my husband start snoring, in the bedroom. I was like, "Ah shit," freaking terrified. So I counted to 3 and threw the cover off and ran, woke him up and we looked, there was no one else in the house. I know there was something there though. The second time we were both asleep in the bedroom at about 4 a.m. again. My husband says he woke up to hear 2 little girls talking. He could hear that they were playing jacks. He could hear the ball bouncing and the metal sound of the jacks on the wood floors. One of the little girls says to the other one, "Watch this." And she goes, "Mama, Mama." and I sat straight up still asleep and said, "What, baby? Once a mom, always a mom, right?" The little girls laughed because it worked. So he kind of shook me awake and I looked at him, then at the doorway where the little girls were. They looked real except their outlines were wavering and they were almost black and white in coloring. They saw us both looking and laughed. Then the older girl grabbed the littler one's hand and they walked right through the bedroom wall and disappeared. 3 things for me. 2 were slasher sightings and 1 was an experience that saved my life. Firstly was in my first house. I was alone in the house with the bathroom door locked as I was taking a shower. I turned to get the soap and there was someone standing right outside the shower door. I thought my roommate came home and was messing with me, so I told him to get lost. Only after finishing my shower I find that the door was indeed locked. Second was that in my current house we often have nuns walking across the corridor from the spare room to our bedroom. Still happens on occasion today. Lastly, it was about 5 years ago when something pulled me back from a pedestrian crossing just as a lorry went barreling through the red light whilst the driver was looking to his left. I surely would have been severely injured if not killed. There was absolutely no one near me to have been able to pull me backwards. I used to work at a daycare, and there was one classroom that always housed the 2-year-olds. Year after year, the kids would whisper in a corner. When asked who they were talking to, they would, without fail, say Jane. I can't say it really fully pushed me over the edge, but it made me, to use a double negative, not believe. I guess I'm agnostic on it. I grew up with a Burmese mountain dog. Anybody that knows them knows they're already calm, gentle giants. Mine never once in his entire life barked or growled at anything. He was calm and stoic, until one night he wasn't. I was about 15, home alone with the dog, and he just lost his shit. He looked around the room, let loose a growl that absolutely thundered in his chest, and started barking like mad. He had stood up and was in a threatening pose, his hair all straightened out and laid flat. He was ready to go. It was pure, pants-shitting terror for what felt like 1,000 or so years. Then he just stopped. His hair mussed back up and he patted over, dropped his mouth in the big doggy grin, and licked my face. If it was a demon or something, it didn't want to mess with my dog again. We were raised non-religious and my parents were very rational, placed a lot of emphasis on science and education. I occasionally felt weird in certain places that had a eerie history, environment, but always put it down to my mind playing tricks. My first year at college I had an encounter that shook me enough that I called home in panic, only to be informed that my family has had the ability to see spirits for multiple generations and that there was nothing to fear. The calm, matter-of-fact way my dad told me that my grandfather, my uncle, some of my cousins and he himself had the sight, you would have thought he was telling me what he had for dinner. Some strange things from my childhood started to make sense. Anyhow, I just wanted to make it go away. Dad guided me, it went away and I just put it all behind me like a bad dream, and then the below happened. I've posted this before, so here goes. I've only seen spirits twice. It is more usual for me to get a feeling of general unease when I'm somewhere with high paranormal activity. This is about the last time I saw a spirit, and only time I saw one so clearly. A few years ago, my BF, now husband, were house hunting and were interested in this nice single-story home in a good neighborhood. We called the agent and asked to view the house. When we went there for the appointment, the agent introduced us to this older man who was the owner of the place. He was sitting in his armchair and didn't get up, but nodded in our direction. We toured the living room, family area and huge, beautiful kitchen with gorgeous wood cabinets. I noticed lots of family photos of the grown-up kids, grandkids etc., and the place had a warm feel to it, but felt a little sad and empty at the same time. As we headed toward the bedrooms, the hallways suddenly seemed cold and dark. All the lights were blazing in the house, as is normal for a house being shown, but I couldn't shake the feeling of cold, dark sorrow as we walked down the hallways toward the bedrooms. As we approached the master bedroom, the agent informed us that we could look around the bedroom, but the owner had requested that we not step inside it as he was still living there. The agent then opened the door and stepped aside so that we could poke our heads in and have a look. At this point, I was feeling unusually cold and sad. When I looked through the doorway, I saw this older woman standing just beyond it, staring back at my BF and I. She appeared as though I was seeing her through a veil of water, with colors faded and outlines blurred. She was just standing there. This aura of inexpressible sorrow flowed from her, and in that moment I knew, Or she communicated to me that she was the old owner's wife and that she was sad because he was suffering so much after her death. Suddenly she was sitting at the foot of the bed, looking at her hand that was gently smoothing the covers. She told me wordlessly that this bed was where she had died after a long illness and her husband had never left her side. She slowly raised her head, looked directly at me, and I heard her words in my head: "How can I leave him when he is so sad and lonely? It hurts so much to see him this way." My BF grasped my shoulder and I was shocked out of my daze. He turned me around and was looking very concerned because I was crying hard, tears streaming freely down my face. I babbled that the owner's wife was here, she died here, and she was sad that he was sad, and that she couldn't leave because he was so sad. My BF, who knew of my sensitivity, had seen nothing but gave me the car keys and told me to go wait in the car while he finished up with the agent. I sat in the car and sobbed for a good while. When my BF came back, he asked me what I had seen. I told him pretty much what I've written above, and then I asked him if the agent said anything. My BF had managed to find out that the old man was selling his house to move in with his son as his wife had recently passed from cancer. He tried to find out if the wife had passed in the house, but the agent had not answered and changed the topic. This experience affected me deeply in many ways. I learned that the departed have a place to go to, and that not coming to terms with our grief affects not only ourselves and our living loved ones, but the fate of the departed as well. If you love someone, you have to learn to let them go, in one way or another. We never did end up getting that house. When I was 18, living on my own for the first time, I kept waking up and seeing a woman with matted, black hair sitting on my bed and smiling at me. A creepy smile. Not a nice one. She scared the SHT out of me. One night I woke up and she was there and slowly held up her hands, and they were grotesque. It looked like third-degree burns covering them. I was talking to my mom and mentioned it, and she just said, "Weird. She hasn't been around since you were a kid. Don't encourage her, she shows up every now and again. Sometimes in nightmares. Sometimes when I wake up at night she's at the foot of the bed being creepy." I've had roommates who have seen her too, without me mentioning it to them ever before. I just ignore her. When my family and I moved into our new home, things started to freak us out. We would hear people talking in other rooms, and sometimes we would hear footsteps coming from the attic. I told my friends when they visited and they laughed at me. All of a sudden a lamp turned on and then off by itself. It was weird, but we just thought the outlet or the lamp switch is broken. However, when I took a look I found out that the lamp wasn't even plugged in. Another day my mom was in the living room and 3 windows and a couple glass stuff broke simultaneously all of a sudden, and she heard voices in another room. I don't exactly believe, but I have seen my dog moving her head to look at the 3 same points back and forth as if there was something there. It was the night after my dad unexpectedly died a few years ago. He always used to make fun of me for watching paranormal shows. I would jokingly tell him that if I ever died, to watch for weird SHT to happen because I was going to give him a sign that it's real. I was laying in bed sobbing and trying to process that I had just lost him. I was trying to be quiet because I was laying next to my boyfriend at the time who was sleeping. It was the absolute most painful feeling I've ever felt to this day. All of a sudden, my phone that was on the nightstand started lighting up and beeping. No notifications. Just flashing on and off while making noises. It wasn't plugged in. Just sitting there. After about 2 minutes of it, I was almost in a panic. I'm still not sure why, but it scared me. I said out loud, "Dad, if that's you, please stop because I'm freaking out." Then it stopped. Just as quickly as it had started. I know it was him. I've regretted telling him to stop since the second it came out of my mouth. I've never really felt him since. Maybe it was him just letting me know he was there and that all the SHT he gave me for believing was worth it. Maybe I was just at a mental breaking point. Who knows? But, I'm glad it happened and I got to experience it. I've had a bunch of things happen in my room as a kid in our old house. It was just unexplained, but I never felt threatened. One morning while playing with my Lego blocks quietly, parents sound asleep in the room next door, I felt the atmosphere change as if somebody entered the room. I turned to look at the door to my room expecting to see mom or dad coming to tell me good morning, but nobody was there. I continued playing, and then heard distinct footsteps in my room. At this point I paused and made no sound to concentrate on the footsteps. I had a thick carpeted floor, and I can almost see where the steps landed, they were so clear. It started from behind me as I sat on the floor, came around and then were in the front of me. I freaked out, and without explaining anything to my parents, I ran into their rooms and insisted to them it was just time to wake up. I was asleep in the same bedroom one night, also at a young age, 7 to 8 years old, and my bed had this squeaky wooden frame that even if I rolled slightly, the bed would squeak loudly. A few times my dad would sneak into my room to say goodnight, but the game would be he would crawl to the foot of my bed and start shaking. I'll never forget how loud the bed squeaked, and I'd always laugh at the miniature earthquake he generated, as I would pounce to the foot of my bed to catch him there laughing. I remember it was late one night, everybody sound asleep, and my bed started to shake violently. I thought it strange Dad would choose not to play these games, so I allowed the bed to continue to shake as I used the squeaking and the shaking to cover my slow movement under my blanket to the foot of the bed, thinking this time I will be the one to scare him. As I pounced out from under the covers to the foot of the bed, there was nobody there, and the shaking stopped at that exact moment. I remember kind of laughing to myself at how silly I must have looked, and that a small earthquake got me real good. The moment I curled back into bed properly, nearly seconds after of settling, the shaking and squeaking of the wood frame began again. Aftershocks, perhaps, I recall thinking, but just to be certain I jumped to check the side and foot of my bed, and just like before, at that exact moment everything stopped shaking. This happened an additional 2 times afterwards, with the commotion always stopping at the exact moment I investigated. My mom yelled at me from next door telling me to be quiet and go to sleep, thinking I was jumping around on the bed or some nonsense. The above happened with me when I was home alone, but with our remote-controlled garage door. If you struck the garage door when it was down, it resonated and made a very loud metallic sound that echoed for a few seconds. I was in the TV room, and the door to the garage was also in this room. I'd hear the garage door shaking loudly, but it always started gently, then would get much more intense. The first time I ran out to investigate, I expected to see my German Shepherd lying against the garage door, scratching himself, thus making the banging noise. Nothing was there. I returned to watching TV, and just like the experience before, this event happened another 3 times. With each time I stick my head out to investigate, everything stopped shaking. One Christmas my grandfather got me this toy robot that moved about on tracks. It was white, had claws for hands and a sort of red visor for eyes, and a big red button on top of his head. Each time you hold down the button and speak, the robot recorded your voice and repeated it back in a filtered voice. I had a shelf of toys on the opposite wall of where my bed was, where this robot rested. One night I was awakened from a pretty deep sleep, and just lay there in bed awake looking across my room. Not too long after of waiting to fall back asleep, the toy robot turned on, said something that I could not really pick up, and drove straight off the shelf and crashed onto my desk that I did my homework on, breaking into several parts. I'd never forget lying there wide-eyed trying to understand what on earth just happened. Before it could even fully compute in my mind, my parents were both in my room with the lights on. They looked at the mess the robot made, and yelled at me for waking them up and playing with my toys at this hour of the night. These are the stories that I remember the best, at age 37 now. Thing is, back then, I never thought about ghosts or spirits or anything like that, and with each incident I always tried to play detective and solve the case instead of just accepting that it was something odd happening. We have moved out of the house many years ago when I turned 15. I still drive by to see the house once a month and unsure who lives there now, but the place looks unwelcoming and a bit run down now. I've never mustered the guts to ask the current homeowners to allow me to visit my old room. I was on the phone to a friend as we were chatting. I heard his mom in the background saying she came back as she has forgot something and said "I love you" to him. 2 minutes later he had to hang up the phone as his dad's phone was calling him. His parents had been in a severe car accident on a motorway and his mother had died in the ambulance. He didn't see his mom in the house, but we both heard her. The accident was around 6 miles away. His dad has suffered a broken arm, leg and cuts. The accident had happened 40 minutes before we heard his mom. Oh God. Okay, so I tell this story every time ghost stuff is brought up. I used to live in NC, in a small town no one's ever heard of. I used to think about ghosts all the time, but only for fun. I never considered it any different from Santa or fairies. One night, my mom told me she was sending me to Bible summer camp and my experiences there were isolating and negative, so I had a breakdown because I really didn't want to go. I didn't know SHT of what spirits could or couldn't do, especially back then, and I wasn't one to pray at that age, so I decided to ask any spirit in my house for help. Once my parents had left, I called out, "Is anyone here? Can you please help me?" a few times. Before I continue, I need to stress, I have lived in that house for about 10 years by that point. I was an abused kid too, so I taught myself to be very keen to every noise the house makes, naturally or by the people living in it. I knew every creak by heart at that point. If someone was in the house, I would know, and I would know who it was based on their walk, and I knew for sure the difference between normal croaks to walking sounds, the difference between the levels, which doors being opened and closed, etc. So, after a while of calling out for help, I hear something, my parents' door unlocking from upstairs, opening, and swinging shut. A pause. I called out again, thinking my parents might still be home and maybe I made a mistake, which I distinctly remember because if they heard me crying I would have gotten yelled at. Hello? Is anyone home? Another pause. Then, I heard footsteps walk along the hall above me tentatively. They were light, like someone who weighed so little, and was walking barefoot. Almost the same sound as a cat. My cat was outside, though, and these were distinctly human steps. No one was home. I called out one more time, hello? The walking slowly made its way to the top of the stairs and paused, as if leering down from the top step, something I would often do if there were a stranger in the house or if I was listening in on people downstairs. Then, very slowly, I heard this entity walk all the way down the steps and leisurely walk towards me down the hall. I saw a glimmer of light like a sunbeam catching the edge of a dress beneath the trees, and the footsteps stopped about a yard out in front of me. I nervously tried to explain myself, but I felt a confusion and irritation from this thing. I didn't hear words or see much of anything, so I didn't know how to close the conversation. I just awkwardly walked away to watch TV. But I felt eyes on me that whole night. I think I just woke them up and they were annoyed. Ever since then, I've been a believer, and I've had more unexplainable events happen there too. But, not much after since I've moved out. Okay, so this is kinda long and sad but also happy. As we all know, little kids can see things that others can't. When I was about 5 I was living in this yellow house. The color is important later. We lived in the upstairs section and my grandmother and great-grandmother lived in the bottom section. One night when I was about to head to bed all sleepy I saw this little girl in a red dress with a black ribbon in her hair. She was just smiling and waved and walked out. At the time I knew about ghosts and stuff cause I would watch those fake shows with my dad. Every night for 2 weeks she would come and stand at the foot of my bed, smile, wave and leave. Well, one night she stayed and I talked to her. I asked her who she was and all that stuff one would ask during those shows. Her name was Helena and she was 6. I don't think I told anyone for a while, or if I did they thought I was just playing make-believe or something. Well, one night Helena said something to me and it was really strange. Tell Ellie I'm as red as a rose and as happy as yellow. That was the last night I saw her for over 2 years. A week or so after she left I was downstairs with my great-grandma coloring and drawing. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I drew Helena. Well, my great-grandma is too long to type lol. Gasped and asked me who I was drawing, so I told her I'm drawing the little girl I see. I told her that we were friends, but I think she went home cause she hasn't been back and I have to tell someone something important. She asked me who and what I had to say. So I told her I had to yell Ellie that she was as red as a rose and as happy as yellow, but that both Ellies in my class didn't know what I was talking about. After I said that, my grandma started crying and me being worried I asked her what was wrong. I found out that her name was Elenia and that she has a twin sister named Helena. And their mother would always tell them to be as red as a rose and as happy as yellow. She ended up showing me a picture of them both with their mom and they were both wearing the same red dress with a black ribbon in their hair. It was in black and white though. After that she went to a chest that was at the foot of her bed that I always liked because it had carvings of flowers and birds but was never allowed to touch it. When she opened it there was her red dress. She told me that when I'm older that I could have the chest and the dresses. It seems that Helena wanted that. Well, 2 years later my grandma passed away and put in the will the chest and all the contents. By then I was big enough to fit the dress, so I put it on, and when I looked in the mirror I saw Helena standing there smiling, and she told me to be as red as a rose and as happy as yellow. It's been several years now. I still have the chest, which I found out was Helena's, and the dress and everything in it. Every now and then I see her just standing there smiling. I only found out a few years ago that Helena was killed by her father when they were both 8. Even to this day we all say that she stuck by her sister's side till the end. Now no one can tell me that ghosts don't exist and little kids can't see them. My dad was terminally ill when I was a teen. One night before bed, I went to say goodnight. As I stood in the hallway, I thought I saw someone standing by his bed. It was late, and it was just out of the corner of my eye. I assumed it was my mom. Out of nowhere, my mom come up behind me, made a soft gasping sound and pushed me into the bathroom and shut the door. I was confused and stayed in there for maybe a minute. When I opened the door, she was standing there in shock. I asked her, "You know, what was that for?" She said, "That was grandfather's nickname, standing over Dad." My grandfather had passed about 2 years before. My dad passed away not too long after. My mom is sure that her dad was there to keep an eye on us at the end of my dad's life. Additionally, not long after my dad died, me and my mom woke to aggressive banging on the sliding glass door on the first floor of our house. We found my little sister screaming and crying, "Let him back in. He wants back in. Please, someone." Stuff like that. She didn't remember it in the morning and doesn't remember it to this day. Second part is less paranormal and just generally creepy, but my mom has kind of always considered the women in our family sensitive to things. Seen ghosts. First night playing Pokemon Go. Figure I do a quick lap around the neighborhood. As I was approaching a turn, a person appeared and ran straight for me. I went in a defensive stance. When I did, the person turned and ran inhumanly fast and went into a dark portion between the houses and disappeared. Even though this person was running at full speed, there was no sound, didn't even appear he was experiencing resistance. I've seen 2 apparitions, one in my house as a child, another in my early 20s when I lost my cell phone on a nature trail. She showed me where the phone was. When I was a kid, we lived in a home provided by us by the county forest preserve deep in the woods in Eel. I found a small headstone in the corner of our huge yard one day. That night, 2 Victorian-era ladies watched me through our bay window in the living room for a few minutes while laying on the couch. They just kinda dissipated into mist and then were taken away by the wind. Weirded me out something fierce. Turns out years later, my brother told me he saw similar stuff too. I've been paranoid all my life, so it's normal for me to hear or see things. I also have nightmares regularly. So when something happens, I think it's my imagination, yet things have happened to me that I'm sure were real. The first was when I was 13 to 14 years old. I was at a funeral and I had to pee. The bathroom was the most terrifying I'd ever seen. It was too big, there was a closed door that led to a totally dark room. I don't know why it was there, and behind the toilet was a typical horror movie bathtub. As soon as I entered, I thought about turning around and leaving, but I definitely had to go to the bathroom. So I walked to the toilet. It was about 3 or 4 meters from the front door, and tried to pee. From the toilet I had a view of the dark room and was sure something was looking at me. I was also afraid that something would come out of the bathroom due to watching horror movies. I tried not to think about this and finally I started to urinate. It was there, when I was most vulnerable, that I heard someone walking beside me, making as much noise as possible, like when a cowboy walks into the tavern and only his boots are heard, and stops behind me. I tried to think that it was nothing and that I shouldn't turn around, but I couldn't help it. Fortunately, there was nobody, but when I turned around I began to feel dizzy. In a single second my vision blurred until I saw everything in black except for a red symbol in the center of my vision. After a few seconds I came back to myself and left that bathroom immediately. I know that isn't an amazing or too scary story, but after that I started to feel fear of bathroom. Sorry if I have mistakes, English isn't my first language. I was working in carpet cleaning with my uncle. One day we were cleaning the rooms in a 2-story motel. I'd go into each room with the pressure washer, clean the carpets around the beds etc. and move on to the next room. After cleaning about 20 to 30 rooms I entered one room on the ground floor at the end. Exact same room, bed, etc. as all the others, but this one felt different. It felt creepy, cold, clammy is the best way I can describe it. I noped out of the room and had to have my uncle clean it. No way I was going back into that room. After finishing the motel, I was talking to the manager and mentioned the lower end room. He casually explained someone had committed suicide in that room the week before. One time my mom was at work about 5 or 6 years ago and a woman she never met comes up to her and says you need to go to the doctor and get your right side looked at. My mom wasn't showing or feeling any signs of anything wrong, so she was super confused, but she's also very superstitious, so she went to the doctors and lo and behold she had a cyst the size of a grapefruit that was about to rupture. I'd how that lady knew, but I've been a pretty firm believer since. I don't know if this counts because it could have been real, but it was creepy to me. One day I went to get groceries with my mom. When I got out of the car and before we went in, I heard a voice in my head completely distinct from my own. It said very clearly and urgently, "Something creepy is going to happen if you go in there. Someone in there wants to hurt you." And I was like, WTF, but I dismissed it and went in anyway. While my mom shopped, I went and looked at the magazines. This was unusual for me because I don't normally look at magazines. I would usually just look at my phone, but for some reason I felt a weird draw to the magazines that day, like something wanted me to go there. There was another guy in the aisle, but he looked distinctive and I definitely had never met him before. I was there for like 15 seconds before I heard the creepiest voice go, "Why hello there," but I didn't turn towards it because I was like, I definitely don't know that guy and there's no way he's talking to me like that. But anyway, I could see out of my peripheral vision that he was turned completely facing me, and I looked up and made eye contact with the strangest looking person I've ever seen. He was extremely pale white and tow-headed with like almost translucent pale blue eyes where the irises and the white of the eye were barely distinguishable. I know this sounds like albinism, but I've met people with albinism and he definitely didn't look anything like them. I don't know how to describe it, but his face didn't look human. Like he looked like an animal in a mask. I don't know how to explain it. Anyway, he kept trying to talk to me, saying things about how nice I looked and how he liked my clothes and body. I tried to inch away slowly to not be rude or cause a scene or whatever. Then he asked me with this almost playfully creepy tone, "Are you shopping alone today?" At which point I was like, FCK it, and I yelled no and walked away. When I looked back, he was gone. I went and hid in the bathroom until my mom came back anyway, so not entirely inexplicable. It could have just been intuition and a weird but real human guy who just happened to bolt away noiselessly as soon as I turned around. But it felt really unnerving, and from what I've heard from other people, it just seems like there are genuine supernatural events that happen, and my experience may or may not have been one of them. It's just too casually believed to not be true. Almost everyone has a ghost story or unexplained experience. Or knows someone where it runs in the family, or it runs in their own family. The far majority of these people aren't doing it for a living, or to get clicks on YouTube, or ever do anything except maybe mention it if it comes up in conversation. In my personal case, on a ghost tour of a very haunted location, I pointed out where a ghost was and its general attitude and tried to warn people about standing over there. The tour guide came in and started talking about what I just told them. In another section of the tour, I stopped, turned, and pointed back down the hallway to a shadowed doorway. "There's something there. Now. It's very disoriented and there's more than one. What the heck is that room?" His response: "Oh, that's where they kept the insane ones locked up." "How did you know?" "Oh, are you a sensitive?" Also, at a bar in San Antonio. Granted, drunk enough to pull this stunt and actually look for ghosts, one of the waitresses mentioned the bar was haunted. Me, being drunk me, asked if she wanted me to point them out. She thought I was full of crap. Of course, I lowered my boundaries and looked hard, then pointed out two. One in the basement that was vague and just occasionally messed with people, and one that wasn't in the bar, but was actually attached to the balcony by the back door and liked to watch the alley. They confirmed both. I've been a lucid dreamer since my mom taught me, at the suggestion of a sleep therapist, to fix my night terrors as a child. It worked. Fast forward 25-ish years. My dad, who I was close with, passed from heart failure in his sleep. A few weeks after, I had a particularly bad day missing him. That night I start dreaming. This one wasn't a lucid one. I can choose to not do it. I sleep better if I don't. It wasn't a nightmare, but it wasn't fun. Long story short, I'd ended up in some kind of abandoned rest stop in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of homeless squatters. No food, no money, no friends. A man walks in. I don't look at him, but I feel him. I feel his shock at the depressing scene, then his crushing sadness, then determination to fix it. He stuck out to me, even in my memory now, as far more solid than any dream figure I'd ever had before. Next thing I know, it's a party. I'm teenager again, wearing the biggest, puffiest, sparkliest ball gown. All the homeless people are suddenly my friends. It's a beautiful, happy, love-filled place. My lucid dreaming kicks in, a little, and for a minute I try to change the scene because as much as I loved that stuff when I was 6, adult me prefers other things. It doesn't work. The scene is stuck and I forget about controlling the dream and have what was, to this day, one of the best dreams/night/restful sleeps of my life. It never occurred to me it was my dad until well after I woke up. Then I just knew, if people can visit us via dreams, if that's at all possible, then that was him. He was checking in on me, saw the unhappy scene, and fixed it. Everything in the party scene, from the dress to the Prince Charmings, it all shouted that these were what my father wanted for his little girl, a fairy tale. So that's what he gave me, just for a bit. It was just so very much something he would do. There have been other things in my life before that. But the question was about belief. I'd recognize my dad anywhere, and I believe that was his goodbye. I'm an atheist. I don't really believe in the supernatural, or at least not things like crystals affecting your energy or zodiac signs having anything to do with anything. But I haven't really had time not believing in ghosts because I saw them as a kid, until I was about 7, and I have some memories of them, and my mom tells some interesting stories of unexplained things that happened. Like the time we were on a road trip and I said there was a ghost kitten in the car and played with it the whole way there, and then when we got there my parents found a dead kitten that had crawled up onto the engine for warmth and died when we left. Or the time we were in a restaurant that was the only building that had withstood a tsunami that had happened about 100 years prior, and I got really nervous and insisted I talk to my mom outside the building, and when we did I said there was a ghost lady talking to me that I didn't like, and then recited a poem she told me about a love lost at sea. The weird thing is that I had a super strong lisp, yet I recited this poem perfectly with the accent of the time and no lisp. Super freaked my mom out, so we left. And I remember what the ghost that lived in my grandma's 90-year-old house looked like, and lots of weird unexplained things happened in that house, though never anything malicious. So for as much as I trust science, I still think there are some things that haven't been discovered yet. Me and my brother seeing a friend who had killed himself the week before sitting in the back seat of my car. He then got out and leaned on the roof of the car. He then vanished. It hasn't been one event. Just unrelated small events that have happened for as long as I remember, mostly at my parents' house. My dad used to be a metal detectorist. He had taken me to a site of a medieval plague village and let me run loose as it was an enclosed field. After a while I came running up to him to tell him there was a woman in a dirty long dress and a poorly looking little boy that kept looking at us, and I didn't like it. It was scary. There wasn't anyone there. My bed will randomly start shaking in the night. This happened last week again. Something pulled the duvet off my feet and sat on the end of the bed, then the bed started shaking. I was wide awake. I'd only just got into bed though. Usually, I wake up to it. My friend and I were out for a drive on a stormy Halloween night and we saw a roughly human-shaped column of mist standing against the wind in a gateway. I was staying in the room of a recently departed family member on a hot summer night and it just felt wrong. I'd taken all the sheets off the bed because it was so hot, but in the middle of the night, I remember waking up briefly being absolutely freezing cold and shivering, but promptly fell back to sleep. When I woke up, all the sheets, the duvet, and the topper were back on the bed on top of me and very neatly made. When I was missing my grandma on Christmas Eve, I asked her to visit me. At some point in the evening I went downstairs and her collection of bookmarks that I kept wedged between two books on the top shelf were across the floor, and the two that were facing up had an extract of the "Do Not Stand at My Grave and Weep" poem, and the other simply said, "I'm fine, thank you." I had a sliding door bolt latch behind me from the inside and locked me out. My dog passed recently and I've once heard his claws on the kitchen floor behind me, heard him come upstairs and him knocking on the door to be let in. We let him in. There's been a few other weird bits and bobs, but these are the most concrete and unexplainable to me. My dog Dalton passed away last November. I have had two incidences that made me believe. A few weeks ago, I was sitting on the couch. It hasn't smelled like him in months. All of a sudden, I smelled him. Very briefly, before it disappeared. Another one happened with my cat. They all hated him, especially my cat Static. They've all gotten used to him being gone. Once, I was playing with Static, and then he froze, went wide-eyed, and just stared at a particular empty space in the hallway. Then he hissed, batted it, and ran away. I'm convinced that Dalton wanted to pay us a visit. Scary. I believe that animals such as cats and dogs are able to see/hear or smell things humans can't. A friend of my father once had such an experience. His dog usually was a very kind and basically perfect dog to have. He was well trained and stuff. One day he started barking at the ceiling. My father's friend lived in the second floor in a 3-floor house, and was really scared for some reason. Above him lived an old woman. So he got up there and rang the bell. Nobody opened, but he was curious, so he used her key that was on top of the door as a safe key because she was old and had Alzheimer's, so that everyone in the house could go up there in case of emergency. He opened the door just to see her sitting in her chair. She died and had peed herself 'cause of, dead. She must have been sitting there quite some time because it smelled really badly. The dog probably smelled her, but he could not. Just an example for animals being able to do things humans can't. Very scary in my opinion. P.S. I'm German, so sorry for my grammar mistakes I might have done. Not believing is what keeps the SHT from messing with you. Pretending to not believe works too, I recommend. My wife rang me at work to tell me my dad, who had died recently, had come to her. They were in a treehouse, which holds significance. Then I nearly fell over when she said it was weird. He looked like he had diamonds in his eyes. A couple of weeks after that, I was at a friend's house in the kitchen eating a sandwich with her 12-year-old daughter at the table. She has form when it comes to the paranormal. She started staring behind me. When I asked her if she was okay, she looked spaced. She said, "He's sorry, you know." "Who's sorry?" I said. "The man with the diamonds in his eyes standing behind you," she said. Already getting out of her chair, she walked around the table, hugged me and said, "He needs you to know how proud he is of you and how much he loved you." We had spread his ashes in the lake with his mother and father. The diamonds on the lake Pop used to call the sparkling as the rising sun hit the water's surface. "I miss you, old man, every day. Love you, you old bastard." I have seen a couple of strange things that just can't be explained, coupled with other accounts from friends that I know have no reason to lie or embellish their stories. Too many people have too many strange encounters for there to not be something going on we just don't understand yet. Having listened to and read so many accounts and theories, my own logic sways me towards the theory of parallel dimensions. I'm late to reply, so this might get lost, but 2 years ago, my granddad died. He died suddenly of a pulmonary embolism on his conservatory floor with my grandma and 2 paramedics beside him. My dad is an only child and he was pretty gutted about his dad dying. My dad went to visit a medium, mainly out of curiosity. This woman had never met or had contact with any of my family. She told Dad that Granddad was beside her, telling her information. She was able to tell my dad, in very high detail, how my granddad died, how he felt while he was dying, how he was feeling when he died, what happened and what was said in the conservatory at the time, etc. The only people who would have known that kind of information was my granddad, Grandma and the paramedics. She also was able to tell Dad details about our family that she couldn't have found anywhere. Dad went home to tell Grandma what the medium said, and my grandma broke down. Everything was 100% accurate. 100%. With no possibility of her researching us beforehand. I know there are people who claim to be able to communicate with the dead, and I know that some of them are scammers, but I absolutely believe that some are very real. I don't know if I'm a believer per se. I tend to be very skeptical about things like this, but something happened to my grandmother years ago and it really made me question the validity of paranormal activity. In the last months of his life, my grandfather had this really old picture of his parents framed and hanging up on a wall in their house. He had become very sick and needed help doing almost everything. He was in no shape to even go to the bathroom on his own, much less rearrange the house decor. My grandmother diligently took care of him while also working a full-time job, so to say that she was exhausted regularly would be an understatement. Anyway, back to the picture hanging on the wall. My grandfather had been asking my grandmother to move it to another place in the house in the weeks before his death because he was afraid that the sun hitting it in the middle of the day would damage it. Oftentimes he would ask when my grandmother was busy doing something else, cooking or whatever, so it oftentimes slipped her mind to do it. Anyway, as time went by he eventually passed away, and for 3 nights in a row following his death the picture fell off the wall onto the floor face down in the middle of the night. My grandmother, still devastated at the loss of her husband, likely had her thoughts elsewhere and just chalked it up to coincidence. Finally, on the 3rd night of it happening, she got out of bed and said, "Okay Jay, I'm moving your picture for you." So she did and hung it up on her bedroom wall where it would be out of the sun, and it was never an issue again. Could it really just be wild coincidence? Maybe, but it certainly made me think twice about it all. When I was younger, 15/16, I had a dream about a childhood friend being involved with some dark things. In the dream he was on fire and using a negative energy. I woke up with the energy in my room. I told my mom about the dream because I thought it was a weird nightmare and thought I had imagined it. A few weeks later, he had tried to burn his house down and had been burned pretty badly, and it came out that he had been practicing a darker form of magic. My mom is still uncomfortable with the fact that I basically told her what happened before it happened. I feel like I have to add that he did go and get help at a psych ward. They said he was schizophrenic, but there was just something off about the things he had involved himself in with his coven before his first and only known episode. He was never the same after that night for obvious reasons. He was still my friend for a while after that, but he didn't talk or act like himself. It was as if the person I knew disappeared. He wasn't the goofy guy I had known, he was a shell of a person. Also, I feel like I have to say, I am not religion shaming. I'm pagan myself. I think he just got involved with things he didn't understand, and unfortunately they happened while he was going through mental health issues. Not sure I believe in ghosts, and I think most things can be explained, but here's my story anyways. Growing up, the house next door to us was someone's second home, and when they were gone, which they usually were except in the summer, we'd help take care of the house and keep an eye on it. As the owner's parents got older, they started staying there for weeks at a time, and the owner would come visit on the weekends, so we'd usually check on them every other day or so. The owner's dad settled into a routine. He'd open the garage and sit in a lawn chair all day waving to everyone who went by, and in the evenings he'd lay in bed and watch TV. Unfortunately, a few years ago he passed away. A few months after, though, weird things started to happen. Late at night the TV turns on. The houses are mirrored, so their master has a window right across from my parents' master, and they could see the light from the TV. We figure they must have gotten into town late, so in the morning my dad tries to take them some mail, but no one is there, so he calls the owner, and the owner confirms no one came up last night and asks us to look inside. Sure enough, TV is off and no one is there. Second night, same thing. TV comes on, so my dad calls the owner, confirms no one should be there, and asks us to check it out. We go in and no one is there, so we turn off the TV. Third night, same thing, but this time I check to make sure there's no alarm for the TV set to turn it on, and nothing. This continues until we finally just unplug the TV. After the first night of no TV, we go again to the house to check and make sure they aren't having electrical issues that could have been turning the TV on somehow and might start a fire, and check the electrical panel by the garage, and we see the old lawn chair has been knocked off the shelf. We tell the owner, and all of us just jokingly say it must be his dad who's bored, so we set the chair up by the driveway, and that's where it's been ever since. When I was about 5 or 6, my grandmother lived in this tiny little house, you know, 1 bed 1 bath type thing, and my brother and I would visit over the summers when we were younger and actually got along with her. Anyways, there was one night that we were all sitting around watching TV. I was starting to feel sick, and my grams told me to go lay down in her bed until she and my brother were done watching TV. Well, I did, and I fell asleep almost instantly. But while I was sleeping, I was having this horrible nightmare that had woken me up and basically left me in a sleep paralysis stage, and this thing was just standing in the corner. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, and it just kept getting closer. The more I tried to close my eyes, the more they felt they stretched open. I still haven't forgotten the way the thing looked, and I haven't had an experience with that thing since. But I've had other hauntings, but they stuck the most. My husband's grandpa was a sweet, very nice man. I did not have a grandfather growing up, so I pretty much just viewed him as mine. When we found out we were having our second child, a boy, we knew we wanted to name him after him. We thought we would surprise him. When I was 7 months pregnant, his diabetes took a turn for the worse, and he had to have 2 toes amputated. We mentally prepared for the realization that this sprightly 90-year-old man probably would lose most of his mobility, and a lot of his personality would go with it. He was always very determined, and was still up to this point driving himself to his lake house 5 hours away and hanging his own Christmas lights. We took weekly trips over to visit with him with our children. He seemed sad. When our son was 6 months old, my husband's grandpa was admitted into the hospital. He was very weak and tired. On a Thursday afternoon, his remaining children, his grandchildren and their wives, and his great-grandchildren gathered into a small ICU room where he told us he had asked his doctor to turn off his ventilator and he was ready to go. He told each of us goodbye separately. He told me to continue to be a great mother and that he loved my family deeply. He then told me about a train set that he had when he was a kid. He kept the train set under his bed at his home. He said that it was an antique, just like him, and the box was tattered, so to be careful with it. He wanted my son to have it. I promised him I would take care of his request. After the doctor returned, we sat together quietly with him as a family. He passed after a few hours and a lot of tears shed. Fast forward to last year. My son is now 2 at this point. We are watching the same Disney movie for the 4th time that day. It is time to wind down. I ask him to lay with me on the couch and relax before we go upstairs to bed. He typically does not fight me on this as he is a humongous snuggler. He runs into the kitchen. I give it a couple of minutes, figuring he is grabbing a toy off the table that just cannot possibly spend the night alone. It finally hits me there is silence. I yell for him. He runs in and says to me, "Papa Lyle is in the kitchen." My husband's eyes dart to me from his phone. I said, "What did you say, Bubba?" He very clearly says to me, "Papa Lyle is in there, it's dark." I am now up and going to the kitchen. I vaguely could tell my son had something in his hand but wasn't registering that due to the shock of hearing him say what he said. I said to him, "Where is Papa Lyle?" He pointed to our kitchen table. On the kitchen table were all of my son's toy trains, not from the train set, sat in a line on the table. I know for a fact my son did not do this because we had a late supper and those trains were pushed from the middle of the table to the end to make room for our plates, and he had then taken a bath and played in the living room up to this point. My son then turned to me and said, "Mama, Papa Lyle's trains." Obviously, we got the antique train set out the next day. My boyfriend, 2-month-old daughter, and I lived in Port Perry, Ontario in a 2-bedroom apartment. The people that used to live in our unit moved into the 3-bedroom unit right next to us. I started noticing weird things like lights being on when I had them off, cupboards open, things moved or flipped upside down. Now I am pretty anal about my lights being off because hydro in Ontario is high, and anal about my place being clean, but I chalked it up to postpartum exhaustion and hormones, until I left for the day with my friend, and when I came home all of my lights were on, all of my cupboards were open, and all of my doors were open. First I thought, okay, well my BF is home. Nope, he was at work. When I called him he automatically assumed that it was the neighbors. They did kind of look like junkies, coming into our place, and they might have a key, and I thought, well, what about the landlord? So me trying to be clever set up my laptop camera to look at the door, and before I left put baby powder down on the ground to see if there were any footprints while I was gone. I left for about an hour to grab groceries, and when I came back no marks on the baby powder and camera's still rolling. Nothing looked out of place, no lights or anything on, everything looked normal. I watched the video and nothing moved, but there was a smash kind of sound, but that could have been anything. I didn't put any thought into it since there were a lot of units and we lived on a main street. So I put my daughter for a nap, got up to go to the bathroom, and oh my god, all of my makeup, face wash, soap, and counter stuff was everywhere, like a tornado ripped through my bathroom. I tripped out like either there was some scary SHT happening or someone was just in here. After that I became like high alert and made sure I always shut lights off, closed everything, and sure as SHT man, 2 days after that I was playing COD in my living room, daughter sleeping, and I hear like a clinging sound coming from my kitchen. Turn the lights on and one of my cupboards is open and 3 glasses sitting on the counter. BTW, I never used glass cups, never liked them, so needless to say I was freaked out. I ended up talking to the neighbor about whether or not she had issues with the landlord entering the unit, and she gave me this weird look and asked why? Things out of place? Basically she was dealing with the same exact thing. She contacted the landlord about it and he laughed, saying it's always been like that, and there is a haunted restaurant next door. Now the haunted restaurant is real, and it's called Jester's Court. I lived there for about 4 more months after that and constantly had similar issues with zero explanation, so yeah, I have never been able to explain what it was. There were a couple of things that happened. 1, there was a time where my younger brother refused to sleep in his own bed, and we are still not sure why. One night he was in bed with me completely out. I had my door open and the hall light on so he could see when he needed to go to the bathroom. Around midnight, I heard some very heavy footsteps coming down the hall. Initially, I thought it was my stepdad. I had my back to the door and was waiting for the shadow on the wall. Only there was no shadow as I heard the footsteps stop outside my doorframe. After a bit, the footsteps went back down hall and down the stairs. I was honestly terrified, but just sorta brushed it off thinking it was just my stepdad. The next morning, I go and ask both him and my mom if they had gotten up in the middle of the night to check on us, and both of them said no. Some spooky shit, too. I have a smoke detector right inside and outside my door. Why? IDV. By this point I was sleeping with my door closed. In the middle of the night, the smoke alarm in my room starts going off. I thought it was just someone downstairs messing around in the kitchen and accidentally set off the alarms. No. It was just mine going off. No one could figure out why either. Nothing was wrong with the wiring, batteries had just been changed, nothing. This happened again later in the year, except it was the one right outside my room. After all of this, I completely stopped letting myself be open to energies/spirits/ghosts. Haven't had an issue since. I still believe though. Growing up, my stepdad always told us about his twin who could do all kinds of things. Granted, my stepdad has been known to embellish things, but to a degree I believe his sister may have some abilities. Whether or not every story he shared is actually true, I don't know. Stuff about possession or general ability to communicate with the dead. That kind of stuff. At the very least, I think she can see things others can't and probably communicate in some level, but I never really sat with her and talked directly. But growing up, I never really encountered or experienced anything myself. I eventually met my husband and he would tell me he could kinda get feelings at times. Like if he needed to do something or really needed to not do something. Seemed odd, but occasionally would jolt up in the middle of the night, "Dear, we need to go to the casino, just trust me." So we would go and maybe win 800 or 1,000, and then some disaster would strike, usually some unexpected expense, and the money won would cover it or at least be enough to get past the issue unscathed. Things like that. Then my stepdad, after him and my mom split, eventually met a woman with similar abilities. This one is worse about being a liar than my stepdad though, so I take everything she says with a grain of salt, but I think more of her lying is self-serving things and less about supernatural. But I still only go by what can be verified, and she kind of helped hubby, and I see the source of his feelings were communications. We have several what we call guides around us. We don't know why a spirit becomes a guide or how, and they will not answer those questions. And one in particular did like to gamble in life and liked when gambling trips were made. We don't know much about them and don't have a clear idea of how many or what all their names are, but at least one has always been with me. After we were made aware, we started to perceive more. We started focusing on actually trying to communicate. I started to get the occasional message and occasional image, so even though we can't go as far as physically seeing them, although he has seen a couple out of the corner of his eye, we can still sort of get the gist usually of what is being conveyed. Weird things happen for a little while. If I did something stupid or made someone mad, I could hear a pillow get slammed or punched really hard in another room. When I was alone, or once I was on the couch with my baby and his bottle next to me on the cushion and it disappeared. So I tore out the cushions and couldn't find it. Went through the house and gave up and made another. After sitting back down for a while, I looked over and the bottle was back in the same place upright on the cushion I had just gotten done tearing out and putting back. They were just trying to get my attention. Once you find that you encounter these things or can perceive these things, you start to find that a lot of people also can, but just don't talk about it because they don't know who they can trust or who will believe them. My friend/neighbor came and she and hubby determined they were mad at something I did, can't remember, and were trying to get my attention to that thing and not do it anymore. And you may wonder how I can believe certain things when my stepdad is known to embellish. It's partly because we did have to call his sister once. It's easy to tell when others see or get the same message you do. One night hubby freaked out because he had this lucid-ass dream about being in our house and a little girl being in the room trying to climb on him. Nothing dirty, and he woke up and went into the bathroom and said he saw her in the mirror. So I got my aunt's number from my stepdad and called her up. She described the girl same as hubby did, and hubby has said in his dream he had called the girl Annalie, and my aunt said she didn't get a clear name but was thinking Annalise or something. And she could see and describe our friend that likes the casino as well. She meant no harm and wasn't trying to be a freaky little horror movie cliche. Just a little kid that knew he could see her and tried to get his attention. Really out there. SHT doesn't seem to happen lately. Thank God, cause it wasn't fun. But we don't have some insane Ouija curse story or anything like that. Really, anyone that had a legit claim to abilities like that seemed to perceive the same people we were without being told beforehand. I consider myself to be a rational person. When weird thing happen when I'm alone, I usually just brush it off because it could just be my mind playing tricks on me, but I had two experiences that really made me question the paranormal. Both of these happened when I was still in school. By the way, my old school is next to a cemetery. Story 1. This happened when I was in the 5th grade. The school year started fine, nothing really unusual. But in the middle of the school year, out of the blue, I started seeing this apparition of what seemed to be a teenaged girl standing in the corner of the classroom, between the door and the board. I only saw her through my peripheral vision, when was bowed down facing my desk, but every time I raised my head to look directly at her direction, she would be gone. As for her physical appearance, she had this dull lifeless gray skin like a dead person. She was skinny and frail looking. Her hair was kind of short, it reached up to the midsection of her neck, but her bangs covered the upper portion of her face so I only saw her lips. She was barefooted and had lots of dried up mud on her feet and legs. She also had a lot of light scratches, wounds and bruises on her arms and legs. Lastly, she wore this torn up knee-length silk/satin nightgown. Like I said, I started seeing this apparition in the middle of the school year. I saw her every day, in the same room, the same corner, the same class, the same time, the same teacher. Every 3 o'clock in the afternoon she would always be there, standing in the same corner, only seen through my peripheral vision. During the first few days it honestly scared me. I honestly felt like I was going insane, but then after that it just annoyed me because it was distracting me from studying. Every time I raised my head to look directly at her, she would be gone. But as soon as I bowed my head to face my book or notebook, she would be standing in that corner again. During the last few days I decided that I would just completely ignore this ghost. Fast forward to Friday and it was the end of the school week. I woke up and thought to myself that I would just have another normal day with this apparition. So I ate my breakfast, went to school, had my classes, and at 3 p.m. as expected she's there again. Standing in the same corner. I'm not really surprised at this point. My teacher gave us her lesson and we were about to have a quiz when she abruptly stops talking. She then pointed at the same corner where I was seeing this apparition and she asked the whole class, "Are you guys seeing things in that corner?" Me and my classmates were all frozen. We were looking at each other with this very confused look on our faces. Then we all started describing what we were seeing to each other. And it turned out that all of us were seeing the same apparition all along, but no one wanted to speak out because we all thought that we were going insane. My teacher was visibly shaken and taken aback. She took a sit and told us to keep quiet and to not speak of it anymore. This was the last time that we saw the apparition. It never showed itself anyone. Story 2. This happened when I was in 6th grade. The day started fine, just like any other normal day. So I went to school, had my first 2 classes, and after that we would have a short 30-minute break. Our history teacher told us to fall in line before proceeding to the cafeteria. So we did, and on our way, we saw our math teacher in one of the classrooms along the hallway. It was the same classroom as story number 1. At this point this classroom didn't have a door because it was broken and they were still having it fixed. So we all said hi to our math teacher, but she seemed to have ignored us. She's a very cranky teacher, but even this was a bit too low for her. Me and my classmates were all like, okay, whatever. We then continued on our way to the cafeteria. We had our snacks, then we went back to our classroom, expecting our math teacher because it was out math class. But she was not there. We waited and obviously us kids started playing and making noise. One of our other teachers passed by and told us to keep quiet because they were having their lesson in the next room and we were distracting them. She then asked us what was our class and who was supposed to be our teacher. We answered her that it was our math class and our math teacher's name. She told us that our math teacher was on leave that day. We were all confused. We told her that we all saw her just before break time. She said, "No, your math teacher is not here." Obviously the whole class was visibly shaken. One of my classmates said that maybe it was doppelganger. Up to this point most of us didn't really know what that was. The next day our math teacher was in school and she questioned us about the story that she heard. We said that we were in a straight line, walking along the hallway when we saw her in one of the classrooms. Being the cranky BTH that she is, she got mad and told us not to make fake stories. We told her that we were not making things up, but she didn't believe us. Fast forward during our lunch break, she approached us with a very bothered look on her face and she said that another class had reported to have seen her yesterday, when she was supposed to be absent. All of us were confused. A few months later this happened again. She was on leave and we saw her again, but she was in the cafeteria. Just like before, she didn't acknowledge us when we greeted her. The next day we discussed it with her again and she was visibly shaken. A few days later she quit. By the way, for context, I'm not in the USA. Our school only have one entrance and we have a guard who records everyone who goes in and out of the school, and in both instances she wasn't recorded in the log book. I'm saying this because some people whom I've told this story to have suggested that maybe our teacher was pranking us. Basically, on top of not being recorded in the log book, she's also a very cranky person who didn't like jokes and pranks. So this is the end. I hope that you enjoyed my long stories. I actually have others, but these 2 stories stuck with me the most because of how many people had witnessed and experienced these events with me. Like I said, I usually just ignore my weird experiences if I'm just the only witness, but having a lot of other people witness the same thing kind of validates the whole experience for me. I was stationed at the Pentagon a couple of years after 9/11. It was after midnight and I had to go to a new office to get some copies. I came out one of the stairwells in what I thought it was the correct corridor, but due to reconstruction, the signs had been taken down. I wandered the corridor for a few minutes trying to get my bearings. I turned a corner and there was a Marine a little ways from me. I tried to get his attention, but he turned and started walking away. He was wearing the guide uniform for the daytime tours. They usually wear the taps on their shoes so the tourists will pay attention to them. But he didn't make any noise. I tried to walk faster. Running isn't done in the Pentagon, but I couldn't catch up to him. Within half a dozen steps, he had turned a corner, causing me to lose sight of him. I turned the corner also and there was only floor and plywood walls with a single exposed light bulb, no doors, no way through. I decided I'd had enough of being lost and went back to where I started and found the place I needed on the second try. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.